Picture this. You wake up in the middle of the night. No Wi-Fi, no electricity, no pizza delivery. Just rats the size of cats and a priest yelling Latin outside your door. Congratulations, you've just time-traveled to the Dark Ages. Forget the shiny knights and fairy tale castles you saw in Disney movies. Real medieval life was a horror comedy mix of mud, disease, and taxes that would make even your landlord blush. Want to take a bath? Too bad. People thought water gave you diseases. Want to survive the plague? Good luck. Your doctor's wearing a bird mask and waving herbs like he's seasoning chicken. But here's the twist. Out of all this chaos, famine, superstition, bloodthirsty kings, somehow Europe survived. And not just survived, it paved the way for the Renaissance, Michelangelo, and yes, eventually pizza. So buckle up, time traveler. Tonight we're diving headfirst into the absurd, the terrifying, and the downright hilarious world of the Dark Ages. And trust me, you won't want to hit skip. Before we start, smash that like button. Because unlike medieval medicine, it actually works. And hit subscribe so you don't miss the next crazy ride through history's wildest nightmares. Close your eyes and imagine this. The year is somewhere around 500 AD. Rome has fallen. Barbarians are running wild across Europe. And your best hope for survival is, well, praying you don't starve. Welcome, my friend, to the Dark Ages. Not dark because everyone suddenly decided to live in caves with no torches, but dark because historians later thought, yeah, that was depressing. Let's slap a gloomy label on it. The Roman Empire had been like the Wi-Fi of the ancient world, connecting everyone, making sure trade flowed, roads were maintained, and armies kept bandits in check. But then, poof, Rome collapses, the Wi-Fi is gone, and suddenly Europe is like a giant offline mode. Roads crumble, bandits set up permanent offices on highways, and the only Google Maps you have is following a river and hoping it doesn't end in a swamp. Life becomes brutally local. No more fancy Roman amphitheaters with chariot races. Forget clean aqueduct water. Now you're drinking from the same muddy stream that your neighbor's pig bathes in. Welcome to the new normal. But here's the kicker. While later historians called it dark, it wasn't pitch black everywhere. In fact, some regions actually flourished. The Byzantines down east, still partying in Constantinople with silk robes and gold mosaics. The Islamic Caliphate, inventing algebra, coffee, and libraries, while Europe was busy arguing about how many angels could fit on a pinhead. So the darkness was mostly in Western Europe, where once proud cities shrank into villages. Literacy rates dropped harder than a drunk night at a tavern, and superstition replaced science. Imagine losing the knowledge of concrete, plumbing, and even simple books because monks were too busy copying Bibles instead of Aristotle. And yet, humans being humans, they adapted. New kingdoms rose. Local warlords declared themselves kings. Villages turned into manors. And the church stepped in like that one nosy neighbor who suddenly takes over the whole block. They claim to have the answers to life, death, and whether or not sneezing was caused by demons. So yes, the Dark Ages were a mess. But messy history makes for the juiciest stories. Now let's peek inside the royal castles. You might imagine kings and queens living like Disney royalty, dancing in ballrooms, sipping wine from golden goblets, and whispering sweet nothings by candlelight. Reality check. Most medieval monarchs were paranoid, half sick from lead poisoning and obsessed with marrying their cousins to keep the bloodline pure. Spoiler, that never ended well. Take the feudal system. It worked like a giant pyramid scheme. The king sat on top, lords and nobles just below, knights under them, and peasants holding the whole thing up. Everyone owed loyalty to someone higher, up the chain, which basically meant peasants were stuck forever working the land, while the upper class argued over who technically owned the cow grazing near the border. Being a king wasn't glamorous either. Your palace might just be a damp stone castle with drafty halls and chamber pots that emptied into the moat. Imagine ruling an entire kingdom while smelling sewage wafting through your window. Fit for a king? More like fit for a raccoon. And paranoia was the royal family's favorite pastime. Kings were constantly looking over their shoulders, terrified of betrayal. One wrong step, and your own brother, or even your wife, could be plotting your downfall. Thrones weren't inherited as much as they were stolen with daggers, poison, or, occasionally, a suspiciously timed hunting accident. Now, let's talk inbreeding. Medieval royals treated marriage like a complicated math equation. If my cousin is also my uncle's daughter, then marrying her will unite our kingdoms, and maybe give our child 3 eyes, but hey, politics first. The obsession with keeping power in the family led to some of the most bizarre family trees in history. Seriously, half of Europe's royalty could trace their bloodlines back to the same handful of ancestors. The irony? While kings married cousins, queens were expected to churn out heirs like medieval baby factories. A queen who failed to produce a male heir often ended up in a convent, or worse, on the chopping block. Henry VIII made that brutally clear a few centuries later when he invented medieval tinder, aka divorcing or beheading wives, until he got the heir he wanted. But here's the kicker. Despite all the drama, common folks rarely cared who sat on the throne. For peasants, kings were as distant as the stars. You lived and died under the same taxes, the same mud, and the same aching back from plowing fields. A new king? Great. Still doesn't fix your empty stomach. So next time you picture medieval royalty as elegant, think again. It was more like a soap opera mixed with Game of Thrones minus the dragons, but with just as much betrayal, paranoia, and bad hygiene. Let's shift the spotlight away from the paranoid kings and into the muddy boots of the people who actually kept the medieval world running, the peasants. Yes, the average man and woman who didn't have silk robes, shiny swords, or palaces. Instead, they had mud, lots and lots of mud. Mud in their fields, mud in their homes, mud on their faces, mud probably in their soup. If medieval Europe had a national flavor, it was mud-seasoned. For peasants, life was a never-ending cycle of work, taxes, and more work. Picture this. You wake up at dawn in your tiny wooden hut that smells like smoke, sweat, and chickens. You've been sleeping on a sack of straw that also doubles as a flea colony. The moment you open your eyes, you remember. Oh, right. You owe your lord a hefty share of everything you produce. Wheat? Half his. Pigs? He gets the best cuts. Wine? Forget it. The nobles drink that. Your diet? Bread, if you're lucky. Gruel, if you're not. Meat was like a surprise lottery prize. Maybe a festival, maybe a feast day, Maybe when a cow accidentally dies, and the Lord graciously allows the peasants to gnaw on the leftovers. You might think, well, at least they had fresh vegetables. Ha! Nice try. Most peasants thought vegetables were pig food. Cabbages and turnips were about as exciting as it got, and you had to grow them yourself while hoping some passing soldier didn't trample your field on his way to a war. And don't even get me started on hygiene. Bathing was not a daily affair. It was more like a special occasion. Rivers doubled as laundry stations, toilets, and sometimes unlucky drowning spots. Imagine trying to wash yourself in the same water that carried away your neighbor's chamber pot. And dental care? Forget it. By the age of 30, most peasants looked like they had been chewing rocks their whole lives, because in a way, they kind of had. Still, life wasn't all misery. Peasants created a strong sense of community. They worked together, celebrated feast, days with drunken singing, and told wild stories around fires to distract themselves from the fact that their roofs leaked every time it rained. Festivals were the rare moments when peasants could laugh, dance, and pretend their lives weren't chained by taxes and famine. If you were really lucky, maybe you'd meet someone to marry, though marriage was often less about love and more about who can help me survive another winter. So, if you ever feel like your 9-to-5 job is draining you, just remember, at least you don't owe half your paycheck to a feudal lord who hasn't showered since Easter. Now let's climb a rung up the feudal ladder and look at knights. These were the supposed heroes of the Middle Ages, the brave defenders of the realm, clad in shining armor, sworn to uphold chivalry. At least, that's the fairy tale version. Reality check. Knights were more like heavily armed tanks who smelled like wet horses and sweat-soaked leather. Training to become a knight was brutal. You didn't just wake up one day, grab a sword, and say, "Call me Sir Dave." Nope. You started as a page, basically a servant boy running errands for noble families. Then, if you didn't trip over your own feet or get killed by accident, you might get promoted to squire. That meant polishing armor, carrying swords, and following your knight around like a medieval intern. Only after years of this bootlicking, and possibly surviving a tournament or two, would you get the ultimate promotion: knighthood. Armor looked impressive, but was about as comfortable as wearing a sauna suit made of steel. Ever worn a heavy backpack for a long time? Now imagine that, but all over your body. The weight could reach up to 50 pounds, making stairs your worst enemy. And forget running. Knights lumbered around like turtles flipped on their backs. Yet somehow they still managed to swing swords and charge into battle. Speaking of battles, knights weren't always the noble defenders of truth and justice. Sometimes they were hired muscle, fighting for whichever lord paid them best. Chivalry, the idea that knights were gallant gentlemen, was more a marketing campaign than reality. Sure, some knights upheld honor, but many acted like armored bullies, raiding villages, torching crops, and collecting taxes with pointy weapons. Imagine being a peasant, already broke, and then Sir Smelly Chainmail shows up demanding more grain for the glory of God and country. Tournaments, though, were the knights' version of sports leagues. Jousting was like NASCAR meets professional wrestling. Two guys on horses charging at each other with giant sticks, and everyone hoping for a dramatic crash. Crowds loved it. Nobles bet money on it. And for knights, it was a chance to show off skill, bravery, and maybe impress a lady in the audience, though she probably couldn't even recognize him under all that metal. Oh, and knights had to follow the so-called code of chivalry, as it preached values like loyalty, honor, and protecting the weak. Sounds great, right? Except in practice, knights often ignored it whenever money or politics got in the way. A knight could be reciting prayers one moment and pillaging a monastery the next. So yes, knights were brave, but they were also flawed humans wrapped in iron. They were both admired and feared, celebrated in poetry, but cursed in peasant gossip. And at the end of the day, they went home smelling like horse barns. Ah, castles. Today we see them on postcards, Disney logos, or wedding venues where people spend $5,000 to pretend they're royal for a day. But in the Middle Ages, castles were less about fairy tales and more about survival. They were like medieval panic. Rooms, giant stone fortresses built because everyone was terrified of getting invaded, robbed, or overthrown. Imagine you're a medieval lord. You've got peasants working your land, you've got taxes pouring in, and you've got enemies lurking on every border. What do? Build yourself the biggest, scariest fortress possible. Walls so thick you could host a dinner party on them. Moats filled with water, or if you were extra paranoid, spikes, mud, or even alligators. Okay, maybe not alligators, but wouldn't that have been fun? Inside, life wasn't exactly luxurious either. Sure, you had a roof that didn't leak like the peasants' huts, but castles were cold, drafty, and smelled like wet stone mixed with firewood smoke. Bedrooms were essentially chambers with giant beds covered in furs, which sounds cozy, until you realize those furs were also home to fleas and lice. Food in castles was better, though. Lords dined on roasted meats, bread, and ale, while musicians strummed lutes in the background. But the kitchens? Absolute chaos. Fires blazing, cooks screaming, pigs being slaughtered in the corner, and some unlucky servant carrying platters up endless spiral staircases. And if the Lord didn't like his meal? Well, congratulations. You might be on dish duty forever, or worse, in the dungeon. Speaking of dungeons, let's talk about those. Every castle had them. Dark stone chambers underground where prisoners, rebels, or unlucky guests were tossed. Forget Netflix and chill. This was rats and chill. Torture devices, rusty chains, and damp walls made sure no one overstayed their welcome. But castles weren't just homes. They were symbols. The taller your tower, the more powerful you looked. Building a massive keep was like flexing on your neighbors. Oh, your castle has 2 towers? Cute. Mine has 6, plus a drawbridge and a murder hole. Yes, that's a real term. A hole in the ceiling above gates to pour boiling oil or rocks on attackers. Medieval architects were basically the inventors of extreme home security. So next time you admire a picturesque castle on a hill, remember, it wasn't built for romance. It was built because everyone was absolutely terrified of everyone else. Now let's move from castles to churches, because if there was one institution more powerful than kings in the Middle Ages, it was the church. Forget politics. Religion was the real game changer. The Pope wasn't just a spiritual leader. He was like the medieval CEO of Europe, pulling strings from Rome. Kings might wear crowns, but they still had to kneel before the Pope, or risk eternal damnation. Medieval people were obsessed with salvation. Life was hard, short, and full of disease, so the promise of heaven was the only comfort. Priests told them, sure, your life is miserable now, but if you behave, you'll get eternal bliss later. Kind of like being told to eat your vegetables so you can have cake after. But the cake was in the afterlife, and no one had ever actually seen it. Churches weren't just places of worship. They were the medieval equivalent of community centers, schools, and sometimes even banks. Yes, banks. People donated money, land, and valuables to the church in hopes of buying favor in the eyes of God. The richer you were, the bigger your donation. And conveniently, the more likely priests would pray for your soul. Want a shave? A few centuries off purgatory? Slip a few gold coins into the donation box. And let's not forget indulgences. These were basically spiritual coupons. Pay money, get sins forgiven. Sounds ridiculous, right? But people bought them like hotcakes. If you lived in a world where plagues, wars, and random famines struck every other week, you'd probably want some heavenly insurance too. Monasteries were another major force. Imagine hundreds of monks living together, copying manuscripts by hand, brewing beer, yes, really, and swearing off worldly pleasures. They were the human printers of their time, preserving knowledge while also hoarding wealth. Meanwhile, nuns dedicated their lives to prayer and service, often running hospitals or helping the poor. But even here, life wasn't always so holy. Political drama, corruption, and power struggles seeped into religious life as well. The architecture of churches was a whole different story. Gothic cathedrals soared into the sky, with stained glass windows that looked like rainbow-colored comic books telling Bible stories to illiterate peasants. Step inside, and you'd be dwarfed by the sheer scale of it. Vaulted ceilings so high, it felt like you were standing in the shadow of heaven itself. And the organ music? Spooky, echoing, enough to make anyone fear God, or at least fear the priest yelling at them from the pulpit. In short, the church was everywhere. It dictated what you could eat, when you could marry, how often you could bathe, and even what you could think. Step out of line, and suddenly you're branded a heretic, which usually ended with a bonfire and you in the starring role. So yes, castles might have protected bodies, but churches claimed to protect souls, and both made sure nobody ever forgot who was in charge. Imagine this. You're sitting in your medieval hut, sipping on some lukewarm ale because water is basically poison, when suddenly your neighbor sneezes. In today's world, you'd say, "Bless you," and move on. But in the 14th century, you'd start writing your will, because that sneeze might be the beginning of the Black Death. The plague wasn't just a disease, it was the apocalypse. It arrived in Europe around 1347, hitching a ride on trade ships full of rats and their flea passengers. One flea bite, and congratulations, you had about a week left to live. First came the fever, then the vomiting, then the delightful black boils called buboes that oozed pus like some medieval horror movie. And the death toll? We're talking about 25 million Europeans gone in just a few years. That's roughly a third of the population. Imagine 1 out of every 3 people you know suddenly vanishing. Your baker? Gone. Your barber surgeon? Yes, the guy who cut hair and amputated legs? Gone. Even your priest, the one who was supposed to save your soul, might keel over before finishing the last rites. The panic was indescribable. Some believed the plague was God's punishment, so they whipped themselves in the streets to repent. Others thought it was spread by bad air, so they carried flowers in their pockets to smell nice things instead of disease. Fun fact, that's where the nursery rhyme "Ring Around the Rosie" supposedly came from. Yes, your childhood song is about millions dying horribly. Sweet dreams. But perhaps the most medieval part of the Black Death was how people reacted. Many thought bathing was dangerous. It opened the pores to disease. So instead of washing, they rubbed themselves with vinegar or herbs. Some even drank potions made of ground emeralds, powdered toads, or, you guessed it, human urine. Spoiler, none of it worked. If you survived the plague, life was never the same. Labor shortages gave peasants bargaining power, the feudal system began to crumble, and Europe changed forever. But let's be real. Most people didn't survive. The Black Death wasn't just a disease, it was the Grim Reaper's world tour. And Europe was the front row. Now you might be thinking, surely medieval doctors had some tricks up their sleeves, right? Oh, they did. But trust me, you wouldn't want them near you. Medicine back then was basically a mix of guesswork, superstition, and wild imagination. The dominant theory was humors, the belief that your body was balanced by 4 magical fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much or too little of one, and boom, you're sick. So what did doctors do? Try to balance them by draining blood, making you vomit, or giving you laxatives strong enough to send you running to the latrine for hours. Take bloodletting, for example. Got a headache? Slice open a vein and drain a pint. Feeling tired? More. Leeches, please. Broken leg? Well, draining blood probably won't help, but hey, it's the only tool in the box, so let's give it a shot. By the end, you were either balanced or just dead from blood loss. Then there were the cures. Have a fever? Drink a potion made of ground-up jewels. Got the plague? Shove a live chicken against your boils. No, I'm not joking. Some doctors swore that a plucked chicken strapped to your armpit could draw out the poison. The only thing it drew out was the chicken's will to live. Surgery was its own nightmare. Anesthetics didn't exist, so operations were performed, while the patient was fully awake, often biting down on a piece of wood. Amputations were common, and sterilization meant wiping the blade on your pants. The operating theater was less hospital and more butcher's shop. Survival rates? Don't ask. And then there were the barber surgeons. Yes, your friendly haircut guy could also remove your appendix. Picture it. You go in for a trim, and next thing you know, he's pulling out a rotten tooth or sawing off your infected toe. They even use the same red and white pole outside their shops to signal both haircutting and bloodletting services. That's why barber poles look the way they do today. Red for blood, white for bandages. Suddenly, supercuts doesn't sound so bad. Herbal remedies also played a role. Doctors prescribed everything from garlic to wormwood, hoping something might stick. Some treatments were harmless, others less so. Mercury was a popular ingredient. It was shiny, mysterious, and extremely toxic. Many patients died not from their illness, but from the cure itself. But here's the kicker. Despite all the madness, medieval medicine did keep some knowledge alive. Monks copied ancient medical texts, Islamic scholars preserved Greek knowledge, and slowly, painfully, humanity stumbled toward modern medicine. Still, if you lived back then and got sick, your best bet wasn't the doctor, it was prayer, and maybe running in the opposite direction. When you hear the word knight, your brain probably conjures up a noble warrior in shiny armor, galloping heroically on a white horse, rescuing princesses and slaying dragons. Hollywood has done a great job of selling this image. But let's hit pause and peek into the medieval reality. It wasn't exactly Camelot with background music and honor codes carved in gold. First, armor. Yes, knights had it. And yes, it was impressive, but it was also hot, heavy, and smelled. Like a locker room that hadn't been cleaned in decades. A full suit of plate armor could weigh up to 60 pounds. Imagine running a marathon in a sauna while carrying a bag of wet laundry. That's medieval combat for you. And despite what the movies show, knights didn't just wear it all day. Most of the time, they wore regular clothes because walking around the village in full armor would have made you look like an overdressed tin can. Training to be a knight started young. Boys as young as 7 were sent off to serve as pages, running errands for older knights. By 14, they became squires, basically unpaid interns who carried armor, polished weapons, and helped their masters mount horses. Only if they survived this medieval internship and proved themselves in battle did they earn the title of knight. So yes, being a knight was less about honor and more about free labor, sweat, and occasional concussions. And the code of chivalry? Let's just say it was more inspirational poster than reality. Knights were supposed to protect the weak and uphold justice, but many were glorified bullies who extorted peasants, looted villages, and switched sides if the money was better. Some knights did live by chivalry, but others were basically medieval gangsters with swords. Oh, and tournaments? They weren't elegant jousting matches with cheering crowds and gentle applause. They were brutal, chaotic melees where dozens of knights charged at each other in a free-for-all. Broken bones, missing teeth, and even deaths were common. Think. Less romantic sport, and more medieval UFC with horses. So yes, knights looked heroic in paintings, but if you lived in the Middle Ages, you might have feared them as much as admired them. Because the truth is, knights were human, flawed, sweaty, ambitious, and often more dangerous to ordinary people than the dragons they never actually fought. Now let's step down from the castles and tournaments into the muddy fields where 90% of the population lived, the peasants. If knights were the rock stars of the medieval world, peasants were the roadies who made the show possible but never got any credit. Peasant life was, how do I put this delicately? Absolutely miserable. You were born in a thatched hut, worked from dawn until dusk, and died young, usually before 40. Your diet consisted mostly of bread, porridge, cabbage, and maybe, if you were lucky, a bit of bacon on Christmas. Meat? That was for lords and kings. Peasants were fueled by carbs, and lots of them. Your job? Farming. From sunup to sundown, you plowed fields, harvested crops, tended livestock, and hoped that the weather wouldn't ruin everything. A bad harvest meant famine, and famine meant watching your family starve. Fun times, but wait, it gets worse. Not only did you work endlessly, but you didn't even own your land. Everything you farmed technically belonged to your lord. You paid taxes in grain, chickens, or even labor, and if you failed, congratulations, you could be punished or evicted. It was like renting an apartment where the landlord also claimed ownership of your dinner and forced you to fix his plumbing. For free entertainment, forget Netflix. At best, you had church festivals, drinking in the local tavern, or watching traveling performers juggle knives. For kids, toys were sticks, stones, or the occasional carved doll. And schooling? Don't even dream about it. Literacy was a luxury peasants couldn't afford. Your education was basically, plant seed here, don't die. Yet despite the misery, peasants were the backbone of medieval society. Without them, there'd be no food, no taxes, no knights in shiny armor. And occasionally, they fought back. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England showed that even the lowest class could rise up when pushed too far. Of course, it ended in brutal suppression. But still, the spirit of rebellion flickered, showing that peasants weren't just passive victims. Life as a medieval peasant was short, hard, and unfair. But if you managed to survive winter, plague, famine, and your lord's taxes, you might just make it to see another spring. And in a world where death lurked around every corner, that was a victory worth celebrating. If you lived in medieval Europe, there was one organization you absolutely could not ignore: the church. It was everywhere, in every village, town, and city. You couldn't swing a wooden spoon without hitting a priest, a monastery, or a shrine. The church wasn't just about faith, it was the Wi-Fi of the medieval world. Everyone was connected to it, whether they wanted to be or not. On the surface, the church promised salvation and eternal paradise. But in practice, it also acted like the ultimate medieval corporation. Priests collected tithes, which meant peasants had to give 10% of everything they produced, grain, livestock, even honey, to the church. Didn't pay? Oops, you're suddenly on the fast track to eternal damnation. Talk about customer service, with threats. Cathedrals, meanwhile, rose like stone giants across Europe. These weren't just places of worship. They were medieval skyscrapers, built over decades, sometimes centuries. Entire generations lived and died while the same cathedral was under construction. For peasants, contributing to these massive projects wasn't optional. You gave money, labor, or both, and the reward was the privilege of praying under a roof you helped build but didn't own. Monasteries, too, weren't just quiet retreats for monks chanting prayers. They were powerhouses of knowledge, brewing beer, copying manuscripts, and managing vast estates. Monks were like the librarians, brewers, and accountants of their day. Of course, some were devout, but others lived comfortably off donations while peasants broke their backs in the fields. And don't forget indulgences. These were the medieval version of a get-out-of-hell coupon. Commit a sin? No problem. Drop some coins in the church's basket and poof! Less time in purgatory. It was brilliant marketing. Monetize guilt, and you've got a revenue stream that never dries up. So yes, the church was the spiritual lifeline of the medieval world, but it was also a political and economic juggernaut. It crowned kings, owned land, and made laws. If you crossed it, your life could turn into a nightmare. Excommunication meant you were socially dead. Imagine being banned from all social media platforms at once, but worse, because your neighbors would literally stop talking to you and your soul was now unfriended by God. In short, the church in the Middle Ages wasn't just about saving souls. It was about power, wealth, and control. Salvation might have been free in theory, but in practice, it came with hidden fees and interest rates worse than any modern bank. If the church was the ultimate corporation, then the Inquisition was its customer support hotline, except instead of answering questions, it asked them, repeatedly, under torture. The Inquisition was created to root out heresy, which sounds noble until you realize heresy could mean almost anything. Did you question the priest? Did you read the Bible in your local language instead of Latin? Congratulations, you're a heretic. Did your neighbor accuse you of strange behavior because you borrowed their goat and didn't return it? Guess what? You're suspicious too. Trials weren't exactly fair. Evidence was flimsy. Confessions were often extracted under torture. And outcomes were predetermined. Common tests included dunking accused witches in rivers. If you floated, you were guilty and burned. If you sank and drowned, you were innocent, but also dead. Either way, justice was served, apparently. The witch hunts that spread across Europe from the late medieval period into the Renaissance were less about actual sorcery and more about fear, scapegoating, and, let's be honest, economics. Witches, conveniently owned property that could be confiscated. So, accusing someone of witchcraft was not just about saving their soul, it was also a convenient way to grab their land or silence an annoying neighbor. Communities lived in constant paranoia. A bad harvest? Must be witches. A plague outbreak? Definitely witches. Did your cow stop producing milk? Obviously witches. Basically, everything from spoiled beer to stubbed toes could be blamed on the supernatural, and people lined up to point fingers. And the punishments? Brutal. Burning at the stake, hanging, public humiliation. Executions became community events, morbid spectacles where people gathered like it was a medieval Netflix binge. Bring the kids, honey. Today's heretic bonfire starts at noon. It's easy to laugh now, but in those days, living under the shadow of the Inquisition meant no one was safe. Anyone could accuse anyone else, and suspicion was enough to ruin your life. Fear was weaponized, and the church profited from it. Looking back, the Inquisition and witch hunts reveal the darker side of medieval society. A world where superstition, fear, and power combined into a deadly cocktail. And while the church promised heaven, it often delivered a very real taste of hell right here on Earth. Imagine waking up one morning in medieval Europe. The sun is shining, the birds are chirping, your cow hasn't run away yet. And suddenly, your neighbor is coughing up blood. Welcome to the Black Death. The plague swept through Europe in the 14th century like an unstoppable horror movie villain. It killed around 1/3 of the entire population. To put that in perspective, imagine if, tomorrow, every third person you know just vanished, or worse, keeled over dramatically in the marketplace. That's what daily life was like. Doctors didn't help much. They had no clue what caused the plague. Some wore those creepy beak masks stuffed with herbs, looking more like rejected Halloween costumes than medical professionals. Treatments? Useless at best, horrifying at worst. Common remedies included bleeding patients with leeches, forcing them to drink vinegar, or covering themselves in human waste. Spoiler, none of it worked. People looked for scapegoats. Jews, beggars, foreigners, basically anyone different was accused of causing the plague. Entire communities were massacred out of sheer panic. If you sneezed at the wrong time, congratulations. You might have just signed your own death warrant. Meanwhile, the church scrambled to explain the catastrophe. Was it God's punishment? A test of faith? Priests offered prayers, processions, and relics, but even holy water couldn't stop the rats and fleas spreading the disease. Faith was shaken, and for many, trust in religious authority cracked like a brittle bone. The social effects were massive. Laborers suddenly became rare, and peasants demanded higher wages. Nobles, desperate for workers, were forced to negotiate or face rebellion. For the survivors, life became strangely better. More land, more opportunities, more bargaining power. Death, ironically, became the great equalizer. So while the Black Death was a nightmare of apocalyptic proportions, it also reshaped Europe. Out of the ashes came new ideas, economic shifts, and eventually the Renaissance. In short, yes, the plague was devastating, but without it, you might not have Leonardo da Vinci or pizza. And really, what's the point of surviving history if there's no pizza at the end? By the time Europe crawled out of the so-called Dark Ages, it had been through wars, famines, plagues, witch hunts, and political drama worthy of a Netflix series. And yet, out of all this chaos, something remarkable happened. The seeds of the modern world were planted. Feudalism, for all its flaws, had provided structure. Castles and knights, once tools of oppression, now became legends fueling tales of chivalry and romance. The church, despite its corruption, preserved knowledge in monasteries that might otherwise have vanished forever. And the horror of the plague forced people to question old systems, paving the way for innovation. Trade expanded, towns grew, and new social classes emerged. The merchant class began challenging the dominance of nobility. Universities sprouted across Europe, and with them came a hunger for knowledge. Suddenly, people weren't just waiting for salvation in the afterlife, they were investing in art, science, and discovery. And then came the Renaissance, a glorious explosion of creativity, curiosity, and cultural rebirth. Artists like Michelangelo and Raphael, thinkers like Galileo and Copernicus, all stood on the shoulders of the medieval world's suffering and survival. Without the crucible of the Dark Ages, this golden era might never have bloomed. So what's the legacy of the Dark Ages? On the one hand, disease, poverty, and superstition. On the other, resilience, adaptation, and transformation. Humanity went through its awkward teenage years, full of pimples, bad decisions, and occasional witch burnings, but eventually grew up into something more refined. The Dark Ages remind us that even in the bleakest times, people find ways to endure, to laugh, and to hope. And maybe that's the ultimate lesson. Civilizations stumble, fall, and sometimes burn down half their neighbors' villages. But in the end, they get back up, dust off their tunics, and build cathedrals, paintings, and pizzas. So after plagues, peasants' rebellions, knights tripping over their shiny armor, and priests selling get-out-of-hell-free cards, we've finally reached the end of our journey through the so-called Dark Ages. And you know what? Humanity somehow survived. Which means if they could get through fleas, leeches, and medieval dentists, then you can probably survive another Monday at work. But hey, before you vanish into the night like a medieval thief stealing chickens, don't forget to smash that like button. Trust me, it hurts less than catching the plague, and hit subscribe. Because this channel is basically your time machine, minus the plague rats, plus a sarcastic guide. That's me. That way, next time we dive into history's wildest stories, whether it's Vikings, cowboys, or emperors with massive ego problems, you won't miss a thing. So, go ahead. Like, subscribe, and share this with that one friend who still thinks the Middle Ages were all about knights in shining armor. Spoiler. It was mostly mud, disease, and terrible fashion choices. See you in the next episode, time travelers.